Let me introduce the second presenter, Dr. Michaël Séguin, who will talk about why is Zionism a settler colonial project. And of course, he's doing it as a review of the Israeli academic post-Zionist debate. Dr. Michaël is an assistant professor at the School of Leadership, Ecology and Equity at St. Paul University, Ottawa, Canada. From reading his paper's abstract, Michaël will present the involvement of Zionist settler project in Palestine from late 19th century until now, and what are the lessons learned from comparing the Israeli and Canadian settlement colonialism, both of which are deeply influenced by the Christian Zionism. Please welcome Dr. Séguin.
Thank you. Good to be here with all of you. Yeah, what I'd like to do in the next 15 minutes is to do a brief review of the post-Zionist debate that happened in the 1990s. And all the questions of settler colonialism was broached in the Israeli academia based on English literature. And why does it matter? Well, I think that it's a great instance where we can see the Jewish supremacy at play. It's one of the first reasons to look at that, especially to the reason used by Zionist author to justify why Israel is not settler colonial. The second reason is that through some of the arguments brought by post-Zionist or anti-Zionist settlers, we might have a glimpse of what might be moving one day again in the Israeli society in terms of possibilities for decolonization. And one last reason is that I think in terms of advocacy, it's always good to be able to use Zionist scholars when it comes to debating the colonial nature of Israel. Not because Palestinians didn't do the job, they do it, and they did it over time since the 60s of using the settler colonial paradigm in the academia. But I think that from some time to time to be able to mobilize also what Zionists are themselves saying about the nature of the project is helpful. And as it is helpful in the Canadian context to refer to First Nations, but also to be able to refer to what some white settlers trying to educate their own communities have been doing. And so basically when we look at this literature of the 1990s, we see kind of three bones of contention. The first one, so in this debate between people saying that Zionism was colonial and those saying that it was not colonial, the first issue is the motivations of the Zionist settlers coming in Palestine. The second one is the status of European powers and their sponsorship. And the last bone of contention is the nature of the Zionist settlement activity. So I will go through those three bones of contention and look at the arguments on both sides, and just do a quick conclusion, a quick wrap-up around what we can learn from that. The first issue was, are the Zionist motivations only national or are they colonial? And basically what Zionist scholars are saying, their rationale is that, Zionism was a utopian national liberation movement, so people like Michel, Aurélie, etc. saying that, you know the story, that Zionist settlers wanted to rebuild the ancient Jewish kingdom sacked by the Roman in the 1st century, and they were simply going back home. And that those settlers couldn't be colonizers because they were refugees fleeing economic and political persecution in Europe, and because they were considered outsiders in Europe, so Jews belonging to the East, it was a kind of coming back home with its own language and its own relationship to the land. What people like Kimberling, Pape, or Shafir replied to them was that, well, being a nationalist or being a utopian movement did not prevent Zionism for being a colonialist one. I mean, it's possible to walk and chew gum at the same time, as we say in French. So you can be both national and colonial together. And that the very idea of creating or recreating a new society on a virgin land without a people, for people without land, is a strong characteristic of settler colonialism. And that other movements, like the Basel Mission in West Africa, that were imbued with utopist wishful thinking and building agricultural colonies and all of that, were also colonialists. And finally, those scholars do say quite strongly that one of the biggest problems with Israeli scholarship is that the social scientists in Israel do over-focus on the intentions of their own intentions as settlers, and do not look very much at the consequences of what they did, especially the consequences on the native Palestinians. So that's about the first argument about the motivations, and can we say that it was colonial or national? And a good way to illustrate that is a quote from Shafir saying that, what, after all, should we call translating one group into land inhabited by another that was followed by the displacement of part of the later group? What is the difference between displacement and expulsion and colonial exploitation? The second argument was, and it's something that is coming back often and often in Zionist circles, to say that Zionism was not, before 1948, a colonial enterprise, is to say, were there a metropolitan sponsor or no metropolitan sponsor? So this whole idea of what is the meaning of the support that Zionists received from the West. And so when we look at the Zionist camp, basically what they say is that, well, the Zionist movement had no metropolis, that there was no real sponsor, that the Ottomans were against them and discriminated against the Zionist movement before the Balfour Declaration, and that when the British came in, okay, yeah, they did support, they need to concede that, they did support quite a lot the Jewish colony, but that this support was circumstantial and self-serving, that it wasn't in any meaningful way something that can be related to a metropolis. The other thing that they say is that the Zionist movement had no motherland, and as such, because there were no motherland, it cannot be colonial. And so that Zionist settlers did not identify as British in any way, that they were, again, often discriminated against by the British, and that the better proof of that is that as soon as they could, they revolted against the British. So they cannot say that Great Britain was a motherland. And also they do mention that Zionist settlers did come from many, many different countries and not a single homeland, and as such they do not have a motherland. And so they strongly, and so they just say that, well, in fact, our movement was self-referential, built on Jewish collective memory. What people, again, like Kimberling, Lanpape, or Yiftacher are replying to that is that, well, indeed, the British Empire did act as a metropolis. That without Zionism, without the British Empire, it would have been impossible to establish all the Zionist institutions that were so key to the founding of the states. Whether we're referring to political institution, economic institution, the military, the Haganah, and all of that. And they are also saying that the fact that there was a revolt against the metropolis, against Great Britain, is a feature that we see in other satellite movements, other settler colonial satellite movements, such as the Basel Mission in East Africa I referred to before, but that we also saw that in the American case, for example. And another point that they are making is that the European and American Jewish diaspora did act as a quasi-motherland, and so that, in fact, the Ashkenazi diaspora brought the financial, the demographic, and the ideological backup that was instrumental to the building of the state of Israel. And that there's nothing exceptional in settler colonial context to have people coming from different countries to settle the land, as we saw in other contexts such as Canada and the USA. And so we can conclude that, well, the Zionist movement was strongly backed by the British Empire as a satellite movement of this empire. And the last argument about that is the debate about the meaning of Zionist settlement activity. Should we consider that, as some Zionist scholars are saying, as isolationist, or should we simply read it as a conquest? And there's a very funny quote I need to start with from the political geographer Aronson, from the Israeli political geographer, saying that Zionism was a case of colonization without colonialism. So I think that's pretty illustrate the way they are thinking. And why do they say that? Well, basically is that They are saying on the anti-colonial, the Zionists not being colonial, that one of the first reasons is that because capital flowed from the Jewish diaspora to Palestine, and so that it was not getting back to the colony, that basically there was no way to make money out of Palestine, and because of that, it cannot be considered as a colonial issue. They're also referring to the fact that Zionist leaders, such as Ben Gurion and others, were driven by socialist ideals, and so that those ideals should have prevented them from exploiting Palestinian Arabs, and that the Zionists voluntarily developed a parallel economy, a parallel society, parallel structures to avoid exploitation of the Palestinians. And that, well, if things did not turn well for the Palestinians in 1948, that's because of the intransigence of the Palestinian elite and their refusal to make concessions. So you will these lines as I do. What people like Shafir and Yiftachel are replying to that is that from the get-go, Zionism was marked by a strong culture of conquest, by a strong structure, a strong culture of frontiers, and that it was ingrained in the Zionist culture to see settlements as something positive, to see it as a personal accomplishment, and that it was also one of the main ways to build the Israeli nation. They also refer to the fact that settler colonialism does not aim so much at the profit of the metropolis in general, but at developing new societies. And that finally, that developing a parallel society to the Palestinians isn't true. Maybe they tried at first to do that, but at the end, it ended up being a conquest of the land, a conquest of the labor, and a conquest of the various markets. And so that we're slowly but surely killing the Palestinian economy and Palestinian villages. And that the Nakba is no exception, that the Nakba of 1948 is just the military realizations of the logic of transfer that has been started since the end of the 19th century, and that is just so central to any settler colonial project. And so to conclude, I have a funny picture that I wanted to share with you. Oh, it's working. Sorry, I got stuck in my nose. Okay, that's the funny picture. Okay. Thank you for the technical support. The picture arrived right on time. For the rest, I could do nothing. So the colonialism, as it's often referred to in general in Israel or in Canada, is stuck in terms of colonialism in general or metropole colonialism. It's when we're exploiting resources and getting them back to the metropolis. And it's fairly easy for Israeli scholars, Zionist scholars, to say, well, we were not colonial because our goal was not to exploit the Palestinians. Where in fact what we're dealing with is the complete erasure of a society to put a new one instead of it. So that's the second picture, the settler colonial one. And it's something that is more and more well known, but I think that making this distinction is very important. And it's very important also in the Canadian context, in the American context, in the Australian context, where we need to, as for myself, as a member of the white majority, to raise the awareness of what it means. What it means to be a settler in that context, what it means to decolonize. And so taking settler colonialism seriously from a white settler perspective means to be able to move away from dominant narrative, in the case of Israel, to move away from the narrative of political Zionism, to be able to rewrite history with the underdog, with the colonized, in that case with the Palestinians. To be able to acknowledge the wrongs that were done and to talk about reparations and to talk about land, and the biggest issue being the land. How are we able to give back and to renegotiate sovereignty? This can sound as wishful thinking, but that's the only way forward. And the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People become a very important tool to do so on a liberty path, and to move away from simply the paradigm of nationalism, but really to look at that from how do we get to respect the rights of the people of the land. Thank you.